Tamu Morning Show.
Oh! Young, no more!
The fort is breached and the wagons are burning.
Why doesn't the Prime Minister just say the truth and tell indigenous peoples that he doesn't give a fuck about their rights?
Free women culture. If you want to free Palestine.
It's a good day to be indigenous.
KREZ 1680 AM.
Sangitamu Turtle Island, welcome to the KREZ 1680 AM morning show. Today is Monday, July 22nd, 2024. As elections in the U.S. struggle to provide adequate means for the working class and common people, people from across the world are traveling to Caracas as international election observers to tell the truth to the world about Venezuela's participatory and leading democracy. Venezuelan elections will be this upcoming Sunday, July 28th. We have weather headlines and more lined up on the show, but first we have correspondent Melanie live from Caracas, Venezuela. Melanie, for years the Venezuelan opposition and corporate media have spread fraud claims about the Venezuelan elections. What can you tell us about this election?
The Venezuelan elections are legit.
Is fraud possible in Venezuela? Venezuelan elections are coming up on July 28th, and the corporate media has recycled a familiar narrative. According to Western outlets, US-backed candidate Edmundo Gonzalez is guaranteed to win unless there is fraud. This leads us to ask, is it possible to have fraud with Venezuela's voting system? Let's see how it works. The first step is biometric identification, as voters place their thumbs in a fingerprint reading machine. This step ensures people only vote at their assigned polling station and can't vote more than once. Once the biometric step is cleared, the voter moves to the electoral booth to pick their candidate on a touch screen. These voting machines are offline until the polls are closed, meaning they cannot be hacked or fiddled with. Also, once the vote is cast, it prints a paper tally confirming the vote. This is deposited in a box. At the end of the voting process, 54% of voting machines are chosen randomly for an audit, open to everyone, to compare the electronic totals with the paper tallies. This has to match to a T, and also ensures that the count is irreversible. After casting the vote, people sign the electoral record, offering yet another fail-safe against ballot stuffing. But that is not all. Parties can have witnesses in all polling centers. And these witnesses have to sign off on a document with the final results. If there is any irregularity, all they have to do is show a final tally from a voting center that does not match the online results. In the past 2 decades, the opposition and their media backers have been eager to cry fraud, not so much to produce any evidence. Apart from the live audit, all political parties take part in more than a dozen other audits, before, during and after the vote, to ensure that everything is working as it should. Electoral observers also witness these steps. And finally, participating parties are given part of an encrypted key and they all have to enter it to validate the final results. In summary, it is very easy to fool readers with unfounded fraud claims. Actually tampering with Venezuela's electoral system? Not so much.
But last but not least, let's turn to Nick Estes from the Red Nation.
Thanks so much. This is a great panel. It's a reunion of sorts of Venezuela, and I'm happy to see everyone here today, and thanks for joining. Before I get into the discussion around indigenous elections in Venezuela, I just want to say that the Lakota Nation and a lot of the nations of the Northern Plains owe a debt of gratitude to the Bolivarian government. And so I had the opportunity last year in October of 2019 to actually thank President Nicolas Maduro for giving us heating assistance in the middle of winter. And this was back in 2007. And there's a connection to my talk because I met some people who were actually indigenous representatives of the Venezuelan government that helped negotiate heating relief for our people in the Northern Plains. So it was great. You know, the first time it was great to thank actual heads of state to say, you know, we remember you because you actually helped us in a time of need, not with, you know, ideological support, but actual material support, right? That kept us warm in these brutal winter months. And then I got to meet the indigenous Venezuelan representatives who actually helped negotiate that deal with indigenous people. And since Citgo, you know, and since then Citgo has been, you know, seized by the United States government and has been broken up. but nonetheless, the project, the international project, especially for Indigenous people, remains alive and well. And in Venezuela, Indigenous people have their own elections. I had the opportunity to not only observe the broader electoral process, but also the specific Indigenous elections that were very historic this year because it was the first time they had them in the traditional community style, assembly style of voting and electing people. And what's really funny about it is that there were some commentators online saying that the photos that we were taking were staged because there was Indigenous leaders who were dropping their, very dramatically dropping their ballots into the ballot box. And what they told me is like, this isn't for show. They're like, we're used to actually voting in public and actually being held accountable by the people we're voting in front of about our electoral decisions. And so we wanted witnesses there to see us voting and casting our ballots, even though it's a secret ballot. So this is the first time that the Indigenous elections have been held this way. Historically, they've been held in the kind of Western, secret ballot, one vote, one person, one vote kind of style. And the Indigenous people have been, Indigenous movements and councils have been pushing back against this, primarily because back in 2015, when the National Assembly was elected into office, there was a widespread criticism that the Indigenous Assembly people were actually elected through fraud. And I talked to many people who felt as if their candidate and their representative in their district, which is the Southern District, there's 3 districts there under the Bolivarian Constitution, Indigenous people are allowed 3 permanent seats in the National Assembly. And in their district, the Southern District, many of them said, we never even went to the polls, so we don't even know who voted for this person. And the current president of the CNE, the election ministry in Venezuela, is Indira Alfonso, and actually challenged those elections of those 3 individuals. And this is, so it was historic for them because they felt like they had the 2015 election stolen from them, that they didn't get the voice that they wanted. And in fact, there were 87 Indigenous community councils in this region of Bolivar in the southern part. We were in a community called Santa Elena, which is right on the border, the Brazilian border. And I met with the elders in the community council of Santa Cruz de Mapari, which is a Pemon Indigenous community. So there were 87 Indigenous community councils that registered to vote in this particular election, and 45 were able to cast their ballots. So it was their participation in the elections actually exceeded the national participation by over 50%. It was a much higher turnout. And the reason why the other delegates weren't able to make it is because, as the previous speakers have mentioned, the gas shortages, and in this region, it's in the bush, and so it's hard to travel. Many of the delegates traveled by boat. Some of them were able to secure airplane travel. Some of them spent days traveling by car to cast their election. Or to cast their ballots for their community for these 3 Indigenous candidates. And so 2 of the people I spoke with on the ground were very interesting. The first is Alejandra, and she's a traditional Pemon healer. She's also a public health expert and a trained nurse and clinician. And according to the Venezuelan Constitution, and she pointed this out to me several times, Indigenous medicinal practices are protected and promoted as long as they comply with bioethical standards agreed upon by the state and health ministries. And in this case of the sanctions, traditional medicinal practices have actually substituted the Western style of medicine, but they still, they obviously still are asking for more of that kind of support. And the other person I met with was Viviana, and she's the head captain of the Mapari community. And she's in charge of community security and community safety. And she's part of a council of 6 elected officials of that specific community, 5 of whom are women and 1 man, who are also selected by the community as well as a council of 7 elders, all of whom are women. And they convene in a traditional Indigenous manner, much like I guess a comparison would be a chapter house in the Navajo Nation. And that's where they make all their community decisions. And it's protected by the state, and it's protected by the Constitution itself. They have that right to organize that way. And it's a very democratic process, right? So one thing to give people an idea of the electoral process for Indigenous people and how it's actually benefited and advanced their movements and their issues, we should look at the U.S. election process. So in the last election, or currently, there are 5 Native American U.S. Congress people out of 435 congressional seats. That's a little over 1% of all of Congress, when Indigenous people make up about 2.4% of the general population, which is about 10 million people, constituting about 570 different tribes. In the Venezuelan National Assembly, in these most recent elections, 20 Indigenous representatives, all of whom except for one, I believe, were all women, out of 277 delegates were elected. And that includes the 3 guaranteed by Constitution. So you had 17 that ran as at-large members and were elected by the general population. So that's 7% of the National Assembly. And Indigenous people in Venezuela only make up 3% of the population, with about 51 distinct Indigenous communities or Indigenous peoples, which is just under 1 million people total in the Venezuelan population. And this was a repudiation of the 2015 elections, where specifically in the South, where Indigenous people felt like they had been disenfranchised by that electoral process by the opposition. And it's important to also point out, and Vijay touched on this a little bit, this region in the state of Bolivar is part of the Orinoco mining arc. And in Western media, they characterize it as a state-led project by Nicolas Maduro, and it's this mega project that's just destroying the natural landscape, and it's doing all these exploitative practices. But it's important to remember that the Bank of England seized 31 tons of gold worth approximately $1.2 billion that belonged not just to the Venezuelan state, but to the Venezuelan people, right? And in this particular region, it's also important to remember that 90% of the mining operations are small operations. Many of them are illegal operations. And historically, this area has been a mining hub going back to at least the early 19th century. So this isn't anything new, but it's been exacerbated by the sanctions regime, because there's 2 processes that are happening. There's an internal migration process where people are moving to the city with the promise of, teaming up with these illegal mining operations and making quick cash, or they're migrating externally out of the country. And this has created a lot of, social and economic problems for the Indigenous communities. However, in this time, the Maduro government has actually, did something really monumental just this year. They returned a sacred object. It's called the Cueca stone, or the grandmother stone, that was seized by former president of Venezuela, Caldera, for a German artist, so that he could create this rock garden, right? And it's this massive stone. It's several tons, in weight. It's very large. It was actually cleaved in half. There's 2 stones that are together. There's the Cueco stone and the Cueca stone, the grandmother and the grandfather stone, and they were separated. And so under Nicolas Maduro and the petitioning of this particular Indigenous community and the work of, the foreign minister, Jorge Ariasa, they were fortunate enough to actually negotiate a return. So even under the economic sanctions and the brutal kind of hybrid war being waged by the United States, there are still advances for the Indigenous community. And I'd say that this is probably the largest object in history that has been repatriated back to Indigenous people, but we hear nothing about it in the mainstream media. And this kind of, I want to wrap this up by connecting it to the region itself, because the Venezuelan, the Bolivarian project is an international project fundamentally. And if we think about the most recent, coups in Honduras in 2009, or even the recent Guatemalan uprising, those uprisings, those coups or those actions happened because the people, specifically Indigenous people, were advocating for a plurinational model, a constitution that was modeled or reflected or similar to the Venezuelan model or the Bolivarian model. And this is not liberalism. This is not constitutional liberalism. Nobody's invested in that process. There's no idealist aspiration of a flat equality that ignores class struggle and colonialism, or a homogenous kind of idea of citizenship. Theirs is a heterogeneity, or a respect for the diversity of civilizations. And the day after the Venezuelan National Assembly elections, I had the opportunity of listening to former Bolivian President Evo Morales give a speech in Caracas. The topic was about the dialogue of civilizations, a concept inspired by former socialist Prime Minister Zapatero of Spain. There was no civilization, only invasion, Morales said of European conquest of Aviala. He used that term. It's an indigenous Central American term for the Western Americas, right? When they, the imperialists, strike, he continued, it's not only against indigenous people. They strike against our model, right? It's not that they strike because they have this fear of indigenous people or brown people. It's because the Bolivian model, the Venezuelan model, actually represent real alternatives that threaten U.S. hegemony. So the United States' relentless decades-long frontal assault of Venezuela is a testament to this statement. Most recently, those attempts have been aimed at eviscerating the legacy of Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution. With sanctions, a gas shortage, COVID-19, and a boycott by the opposition, the combined effects of a U.S. hybrid war, only 30% of Venezuelan electorate cast ballots on December 6th. And the parties supporting President Maduro won 68% of the vote and 253 seats in the National Assembly. And in the meantime, in the lead up to the elections, the Trump administration spent several months trying to defraud the electoral process, even going so as far as to sanction moderate opposition candidates. So they're not only sanctioning the Socialist Party, they're also sanctioning the opposition candidates. And mind you, this is this is Trump, the guy who's also delegitimizing his own elections. So it's important to remember that, as Vijay pointed out, moderate opposition candidates, like a majority of Venezuelans, oppose the sanctions that have been attributed to the deaths of tens of thousands of people, migrations of millions, and the daily immiseration of the poorest. But the opposition's proposed alternative of massive privatization of the economy has few supporters. And one person that I talked to during this electoral process he said something that actually stuck out to me. He says it's easier to vote and get a PCR test than it is to get a tank of gas. So there's not a lack of faith in the electoral system. But even with the economic sanctions, the elected executive and legislative branches have a mandate to govern. Overlapping forms of governance, which include indigenous community councils, reflect indigenous modes of governance and a possibility to continue the Bolivarian process to increase representation and rights for indigenous people. And so there is, in a sense, to evoke somebody like Frantz Fanon, a Manichaean view in the way we view imperialism and the struggle for decolonization. As Evo Morales said, there is an imperialist civilization and a people civilization. Life is sacred, he said, and that's the view of socialism.
Amidst this global pandemic, the U.S. decided to escalate politically and militarily their threats and intimidation towards Venezuela. And this is the piece that really moved me even more to be part of this conversation, why I'm so grateful that this was the first conversation in the series, because we are in a vulnerable state in Venezuela. There is a lot of difficulty to buy any goods, from food to medications to vaccines. And right now, when not only Venezuela is vulnerable, but the entire world is going through a crisis, it is completely absurd that Trump is making direct moves to position military forces and a media narrative that would support a possible war. So on March 26, as Abril said, when we were on the second week of shelter in place in California, the U.S. Department of Justice announced false charges of terrorism and drug trafficking against President Maduro and offered $15 million for his apprehension. We all know that when you are talking about the president of a country and apprehending them, this really means $15 million for his head, right? Like that's just pretty clear to me, at least, right? This is not somebody who just lives in the corner building next to somebody that's just gonna be, arrested easily. So that is, to me, kind of like the clearest sign of escalation militarily. And if there are any doubts, then he sent an even more clear message. So the Pentagon deployed military contingents near the coast of Venezuela, while also deploying US military personnel in Colombia near the border. And all of this deployment was under the disguise of an anti-drug trafficking action in the Caribbean. To make matters even worse, the Pentagon sent US Navy destroyers, littoral combat ships, Coast Guard cutters, helicopters, patrol planes, amongst others. And all of this at the same time as troops are being withdrawn from Iraq. I don't think that's a coincidence. And as was mentioned also by Abril, I think it's very ironic that there is all of a sudden all this conversation about Venezuela being a drug terrorist state when it is well known and it's been well documented for decades that most of the production of substances occurs in Colombia and Mexico, and most of the consumption occurs in the US, right? It takes place in the US. And I want to now move a little bit into contextualizing what's happening in Venezuela by understanding what has happened in the region, especially given the phenomenon of Guaidó, or White Dog, how he's called in Venezuela. So one of the main kind of claims for illegitimacy in the recent years against Maduro has been that supposedly there was electoral fraud in 2018 when Venezuela held their last presidential elections. So during those elections in May 2018, the claims of fraud were also followed by the fact that the Venezuelan opposition requested the UN to not send international observers to the elections. Venezuela, for the past 20 years, has had very transparent election processes that have been well celebrated and well regarded throughout the world for many reasons. One of the reasons is there are hundreds of international observers that come to Venezuela every time. And it's very interesting, you know, that the opposition worried about electoral fraud asked the UN to prohibit international observers from going to Venezuela. I think we can continue to kind of connect the dots around the right in the US, the right in Venezuela, right? There is a very similar script that the right wing has. Henry Falcón was the main candidate running for president against Maduro, representing opposition forces. He was actually expelled from his right-wing party called the MUD because of running, which actually created a lot of tension in the opposition from the more extreme right-wing forces that expelled him for running, and who also said that nobody in the opposition should come out and vote, that they should not exercise their right to vote. Because again, they were afraid of electoral fraud. And not only he was expelled, the White House threatened personal sanctions against him for running. And here in San Francisco, during elections, presidential elections in particular, you can vote in your consulate. Well, now not anymore because we don't have consulates or an embassy in the United States because Trump kicked everybody out. But during that last election, when people were able to vote, what happened was I know Venezuelans. Most of the Venezuelans I know here are part of the opposition, and they were calling each other and calling also those of us who are not part of the opposition to say that if anybody got anywhere near the consulate, that they would get physically assaulted, that they would get beat up. And that's the same thing that I heard from my friends on the ground in Venezuela, that people were being personally threatened for wanting to exercise their right to vote. With all of these problems, there was still an election, and 31% of eligible voters casted their ballots, same number of people as the last Obama presidential election. And I can't remember if also Trump, I don't know how many people voted in that election. And Maduro wins by 67% of the votes. Another one of the electoral fraud claims that the right has every single time, not just this last election, is that a lot of non-Venezuelans can vote. And what they mean by that is that the Venezuelan government has given IDs to Colombian and Ecuadorian immigrants who've been part of the makeup of Venezuela for years. And they're exerting, their xenophobic, I guess, opinions onto their analysis of electoral fraud, right? So they keep complaining using this xenophobic rhetoric around everybody and their mother can vote and it's not fair. So moving right along, he wins. There is somewhat some peace for a few months. And in fact, that summer when I went, some friends of mine were discussing how they were worried that in January of the following year, that they were expecting something was gonna be done, that the right was gonna do something to try to, Rachel, oh my goodness, thank you, 2 minutes. Oh my goodness, and I'm not even halfway. Beautiful. So Guaidó comes out of nowhere and declares himself president in January 2019, minutes after Mike Pence sends a video where he begins speaking Spanish, expressing support for Guaidó. So this was a very concerted effort that at the time they denied. Later on, the whole truth came out that, of course, they were coordinating these efforts between the White House here in the US and Venezuela. And it's been now proven that USAID, so USAID, gave Guaidó $200 million last year to rebuild the economy and the country. And that actually also caused a lot of tension in the opposition because, of course, some people got the money and some people didn't. And all of this was happening while in Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, and Ecuador, there were uprisings against neoliberal governments, including, as we know, right, the protests that were happening in Chile, in Ecuador, for example, which we were talking about, the cases, right, the incredible amount of cases of COVID-19 there. The new president, President Moreno, revoked a decree that eliminated fuel subsidies and led to a struggle between the government and indigenous organizations. And that sparked a series of uprisings. And in the last part of the year, we heard how in Colombia there were also uprisings against the neoliberal government. And now I'm trying to figure out where to move in the last few seconds. So on the ground, what the sanctions have looked like is an inability to buy medications, inability to buy paper to print bills so that was a big deal in the past 2 years, with people not having cash to pay for stuff, materials to print passports, materials to refine petroleum to produce gasoline, so shortage of gas. Also problems accessing vaccines, like for malaria and measles, which we didn't have those two illnesses as problems in our country anymore. And in the past year and a half, there's been a slow spread again. And even though we have all these monetary problems because of the sanctions, the US government is so blatant in their desire to get this Guaido guy to have any kind of power that he was given the assets that Citgo, our oil company based in the US, has, and that amounts to $10 billion. We have no idea what's happening with that money and how it's being used. And, to close, I can't wait for all of the questions that you may have in the Q&A, but I really want to do a plug for support the end of sanctions, to continue looking for ways to work together, to understand that the migrant and refugee crisis here is connected to our, the US foreign policies, our houseless crisis in California and in the US. There are so many solutions that we can learn from countries like Venezuela, who have built millions of homes in a span of a decade with very little money. The occupation of Palestine and their decades-long resistance has so much to teach us now during COVID-19, right? What are the ways in which we can really learn from each other? And I want to close with an ask to write statements of support with groups, with organizations, with your household. Sign petitions. Code Pink at least every month has a different petition, and their petitions are really good, and they tend to organize good international kind of solidarity actions with connected to Congress and legislators at the federal level. Follow organizations like the Center for Political Education, the Malcolm X grassroots movement, the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, the Red Nation, and let's continue inviting our friends and family to care about international solidarity issues. Thank you.
Sanctions, imagine, I always tell people this, people think of when you say, "Oh, I'm a socialist," or I'm a leftist, and this is the kind of society I want to live in. And this is what we're trying to build. And you mentioned this earlier, that most people use Venezuela as the negative example. They say this is what socialism brings, without ever fully understanding the impact of sanctions. It's almost as if for us to be really quote unquote socialists, that we have to be eating out of a dumpster. Right. And we can see this is just a derogatory accusation, but we can see the social progress of a country like, Bolivia, and the way that when you have an indigenous socialism integrated within all of society, how much it improved everyone's, livelihood, and how that project, happened in Venezuela as well, but how the sanctions themselves arrest that progress. And so what would Venezuela look like without US sanctions? And what kind of society is the Bolivarian Revolution building?
No, I think what we would have not lost the time that that we've lost in improving our system. I think we would have been able to have a stronger healthcare system, a stronger food sovereignty system, even a stronger industry. A lot of things would have been better off now if we hadn't had this blockade in place, for sure. What we've been trying to build is a more just society, more equitable society. We had some of these things before, and when I say before, I mean a couple of years ago. I mean, this was a successful model until sanctions started really attacking it and hurting it the way it has. So it's not an issue that it's not like they say, oh well, socialism doesn't work. Or socialism was working very well in Venezuela, right before 2015 and the sanctions. Also, there were other issues too. I mean, obviously that we have to overcome. Venezuela has mainly been an oil exporter for the last 100 years, and that's not something that we wanted to we wanted to be that way. It's just something that it was imposed by the international distribution of labor back in the day, and overcoming that is difficult. When President Chavez came in, when poverty rates nearing 70%, and this is back in 1999, and one of the priorities there was to tend to that poverty, and we had a literacy that we eradicated because of socialist measures, because of cooperation with Cuba, for example, and a strong literacy campaign that eradicated illiteracy in this country. But there were a lot of issues that had to be dealt with, and then you had to prioritize. Well, what do we do? Do we switch the economic model? Yes, eventually we have to. We have to find another model where is sustainable for the environment, is sustainable for us. But meanwhile, we need to take care of the real needs of the population. So most of the investment at that point went to developing healthcare, education, housing, all these things that have been limited for people before. So in the middle of that transformation, then we've been hit with these sanctions. We've been attacked with varying prices of oil, which is also an important variable. Because these changes to overcome the backwardness that is promoted by neoliberalism is not something that you could do overnight. However, you'll be amazed at how many things you can actually get accomplished when you just decide to put profits to the side and invest in your population. So there's a lot of things that we had already improved, and I'm sure we could perfectly come back to an even better point, reaching self sustainability in food, curbing the need for housing. We reached the goal in when the housing projects started. The housing mission started in 2010. We had a deficit of about 3 million homes in a country of about 30 million people. And by now, by the end of last year, we reached the building of those homes. So we've been overcoming even in the middle of the sanctions, because the priority has still been social investment. We've been overcoming some of these problems, and if we didn't have the sanctions in the way, we could definitely achieve a lot more. At the same time, maybe one of the side effects, or maybe unintended effects, I should say, of the sanctions has been something very positive as well, which is that community, the community has learned to deal with this aggression and turn it into more solidarity and more unity. And this is something that for us now, looking forward to what we can build once these sanctions are out of the way, once we overcome some of these difficulties, we now have a even stronger community, a sense of community, a stronger sense of solidarity amongst the people, a stronger sense that we need to stick together in order to improve our lives. Look at the difference in the way that some of the countries have been dealing with this current crisis, and the way Venezuela has been able to do so, because people have a deeper understanding of how we need to help each other in times of need. I see reports some countries entering not only into panic but also into complete isolation, in the sense that I take care of my own problems and screw the rest of the world. And that's not the response that we're seeing in Venezuela. We're seeing a response, like I said, the communities looking out for the elderly who apparently have been more affected, with this virus. Communities looking out for how to, helping the children get schooled. I mean, they're sharing information for children to get schooled at home while, we can't go to classes, and all these things. They may be small in the large scheme of things, but when you see that communities are focused on these issues, you see, that's also been one of our strengths, and that's the strength moving forward when once we overcome these aggressions.
So what message do you have for North Americans, especially those living in the United States and Canada? What would you like them to know about Venezuela and what we can best do to support your struggle and your movements?
Well, I wanted to know, first of all, that we feel that we are in the same struggle. That the fact that we have several strong differences with their government does not mean that in any way we have any distance from the people of the United States and the people of Canada. I mean, we feel the same. We are attacked by the same discrimination, by the same racism. We're attacked by the same corporate interests that that want to to take over Venezuela's riches. It's the same people that that want to make sure that people in Flint, Michigan don't have clean water. It's the same people that want to cut off water supplies here in Venezuela and want to hurt the population. I mean, we know how it feels like, and we are on this same struggle together. We are rebelling against a model that is for profit, that is for for the enriching of a few, and we're trying to work for a model that serves all, that that takes care of people first, and I'm sure that we have a lot more in common with the everyday people of Canada and of the United States than we imagine. So what we say, we want to maintain those ties strong. We want us to get to know each other. We want us to strengthen our exchange, communications. I would ask people to learn about Venezuela, what Venezuela is. Once this outbreak is over and everything, to come visit Venezuela and realize what we're doing with your own eyes. You don't have to believe me. You can come see it for yourselves. We want to make sure that people understand that this, we're struggling here for humanity. We're struggling here to defend what we think are core principles of humanity: solidarity. The put people first, put people's needs first. Those are the same, and I'm sure those are the same issues that most of the people of North America also want to struggle for. So we're in this together, and hopefully, as we see change here, you see change there as well, in constructing new ways of organizing, of uniting, of working together to overcome this system that is trying to exploit us all.
Venezuela to me seemed like a large Indian reservation. Wow. Meaning that it was while there was this ongoing kind of siege, because Indian reservations were ongoing sieges. I mean, we're not allowed to develop independent, economies. We're supposed to be confined. There's all these restrictions, and we don't have the kinds of sanctions that Venezuela has right now, but the same kind of tactics of trying to choose our leadership for us, trying to impose Yankee democracy, trying to determine the kind of destiny of our people, while also forcing us into these subordinate roles. For here, the Navajo Nation is a perfect example, because it's a resource colony, right? Mm-hmm. It's where the United States and this region wants to draw its energy from. And, even with the transition that they're proposing, the Navajo Nation, because of the current contracts that exist in the power lines and like the electrical grids, even if they did transition to like 100% renewable, like solar energy, all of that energy and electricity that would be produced by these solar panels is already spoken for non-Indigenous people.
Wow.
And so like, I just think about this like in the context of Venezuela, being taking the path of resource nationalism and sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, but being unable to like produce that wealth for its own people. So I guess the other question that I would like to, or I guess perspective that I would like to hear is the kind of the gathering itself and what kind of people were represented, and what really stuck out to you as part of this, because it was like a 3-day event. There were workshops and there were speeches, and you got to see Maduro.
Yep, 2 times. Yeah, it was 1,000 delegates from 73 different countries and throughout Venezuela. It was representatives from political parties, so socialist political parties, but also just like social movements. So not everybody in the room was a Marxist or even like a socialist. There was all kinds of politics. I met a African Venezuelan anarchist. It was cool. But yeah, so it was mostly folks from the global South who had a shared interest in organizing against Yankee imperialism, because they were from places like Iran, places like North Korea, places like Ecuador, like Bolivia. There was a large contingent from Bolivia. Obviously, Africans from the United States, Indigenous peoples from all over the Western Hemisphere. Basically, the thing that unified us all is that we were all facing this existential threat in the form of Yankee imperialism that thinks that they can come to where we live and decide how we're gonna exist. All these people who wanted to live in the way that they determined for themselves. That was the thing that unified the politics in the room. And it was really energizing because like in the United States, discussions about imperialism are like so confused.
Yeah. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the confusion around imperialism in the United States.
Like I've legit heard people be like, U.S. imperialism is not the most evil thing. Or like whenever the United States attacks a country, like that people will take that as a particular time to talk about that country's contradictions. Like that happens every single time. It happened with Bolivia, where people were like, had all these critiques of Chavez coming out of the woodwork as actual fascists were taking power.
Right.
Same thing with Iran. The United States straight up murdered like a very prominent figure in Iran's military, and people were like, well, he kind of had it coming. Like that's the discourse that you get in the United States when this country which is like the greatest force for violence on the entire world and on the entire planet decides to attack another much poorer, much weaker country. But in the anti-imperialist conference space in Caracas, like everybody was clear about what the primary threat was. There was no confusion. There was no like, let's talk about Iranian imperialism. Let's talk about, authoritarianism. Like there was none of that, because the people that were at that conference are directly affected by U.S. imperialism. They're clear on who the threat is.
Oh no.
Go ahead.
Keep going.
No, but yeah, it's just very, very clarifying, because a lot of times when people give those lines, give their like extremely ill-timed critiques about countries that are under open attack by their government, they're saying that they're speaking up for the global South. But when you go to the global South itself, it's very, very clear who the threat is and who they perceive to be the threat.
I always think of the New York Times obituary for Sitting Bull, where they basically said, we're glad that these soldiers had sent him to the happy hunting grounds.
Jesus.
It's like a paraphrasing but partial quote of that that editorial that came out like 2 days after he was assassinated by Indian police. But he was, that was like a direct intervention to determine the outcome and the leadership of our nation, of the Lakota Nation. But it's also fascinating because a similar editorial came out against Evo Morales the day after, he was, or several days after he was militarily ousted through a military coup from the presidency.
Right.
And it was basically saying he's a violent, corrupt Indigenous man. And so those tropes haven't, really ended. And I think, like even tomorrow's the Super Bowl. By the time this airs, the Super Bowl will have already passed. But we can see like superficially like the kind of racist undertones of the Super Bowl. You have primarily Black men who are getting brutalized on a field owned by white owners, right? Who are going through, even though they're millionaires in many ways, a lot of them die in poverty because they have to pay medical bills and they die really young, and it's really tragic. But also the fact that most of the the players that are being filtered from high schools are young black men, and because white parents know that this is a dangerous sport. On top of that, you have the racist team names like the 49ers, the 49er genociders, who basically were the miners who genocided California Indians.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah, that's where the 49ers came from. 1849 was the California Gold Rush.
Wow. And
so that was like the mass genocide of California Indians. We're playing the Chiefs, the Kansas City Chiefs, right? And then on top of that, you have the U.S. military who's bankrolling a lot of the NFL, ads, and the NFL then becomes a recruitment tool for young, people of colonized people who are watching this. And we can think about like maybe the racist aspects, like the internal politics of the United States, but we never really assume that maybe like the actual military culture of the US is like kind of definitive of its external projection into other countries, that it's not just like, the exploitation of African and indigenous people in this country, but that's externalized to other countries. Like, can you imagine if we talked about the ways in which just the invasion of Iraq has killed millions of Iraqis, right? So these are things that I think is really important, especially coming from that perspective, and why it's important for people who are, in the United States, but not entirely of it, to be conscious of these movements, these global movements against the United States.
Absolutely. And I also think that people have to, like, if they lie about Africans that get murdered by the police, if they constantly demonize us and dehumanize us, when that happens to us, then why do you think they would be telling the truth when they go to an African country, or when they go to an indigenous country, or when they go to a poor brown country and destroy it? Why would you think they'd be telling the truth about that government? And why do you think the discourse is the same every single time? It's always authoritarianism. It's always for their own good. It's always they don't know how to govern themselves. They need our help. Like, it's always the same, and people always fall for it in the United States.
And it's always, in the US, it's always, if they are sympathetic, or if they're like knowledgeable of US imperialism, then they have to try to find the pure actor. Like in Iran, we have to support, or like Bolivia, for example, we have to support, they have this, they were critical of Evo Morales. And it's like, these are individuals. Most of them are petty bourgeois individuals and intellectuals or academics or NGO employees, it's like, they don't represent the actual organized indigenous masses of people. Right. And that's why they hated Evo Morales so much, is because he represented that mass, Moss is the mass line of indigenous people, right? The movement towards socialism. And it's the same in Venezuela. There's a lot of, and what happens in the US is like, from that perspective, we end up flattening these organizations. There's on one hand, we understand, like, yes, the US is trying to intervene in Venezuela, but on the other hand, it's like you either see like the current regime as the regime, right? They use that language as authoritarian, with no connection to like the actual people who voted that person into power, oftentimes at larger margins than actual US presidents get elected.
Exactly. And fair elections.
Yeah, and they actually get elected by popular votes. But there's just such a confusion about that, and I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think it's important for people to go to these contexts, and we have much more to learn from Venezuelans than they do from us.
Absolutely.
And that goes for the rest of the world too.
Yeah, people are miles ahead of us in the United States when it comes to building revolution. And the fact that people in the US are looking like, you're not doing that right. I'm just like, but what are you doing? What are we?
What successful revolution and left movement are you a part of?
Precisely. Yeah.
And the question that I have is, in the context of current economic war being waged against Venezuela, and the misinformation that's being propagated in the US media about socialism, what do you have to say to indigenous people of the United States and of North America?
Wow.
Big question.
No, first of all, yes, indeed. President Chavez was a man that wanted to share what he had, or what the Venezuelan had, not the leftovers, but what we had. If it was plenty, if it was a lot, then we would share it. But if it was few, then we would share it as well. That is also a something that Fidel Castro always said. We have to share what we have, not the leftovers of what we have. And what he did with the heating oil is what he did here in Venezuela. There's a video of once when he went to the opening of a prison, a new penitentiary center in Falcón, in the Estado Falcón, the state. And he was driving, and it's a marvelous prison. No, it's all new, all security processes, and for the prisoners, everything is better. But then some people approached Comandante Chavez, and they said, Chavez, help us, because we worked in the construction of this prison, but now we have no job, and we live right here, and we have no water, and we have no. So we said, how is this possible? And he called the engineers and the Minister of Justice, those who were responsible for building the prison, and he was very hard to them. And he told them, how is this possible? These people live right here, less than 2 kilometers from the prison. They have no water supply. Why? How can this happen? Now we have a new prison, but everything around is bad. How can this be possible? So he even fired some people that day, and then they built what for the needs of these people, everything was satisfied. But it's what he did, and we could not have a important oil company in the United States, and there's poor people or people who have needs, and then we just sell oil and get revenues, and that's not what Chavez was always concerned and worried for the people, especially for those who had more needs. And that's what he did. He asked, how can we help people in the US who have needs, the most humble people? And they told him, well, one of the ways is heating oil. So that, especially if we have Citgo, we can help with heating oil. And he did it in there, but he also did it in New York, in Bronx, and other places. No? Now Citgo has been stolen from the Venezuelan state, no? But really stolen. No? It's not a legal issue. It was all this. The revenue from Citgo was used to produce more oil, and all the oil income is used for education, for health, for everything. But also some of the revenue of Citgo was invested in social projects in the United States. So now, with this President Trump sanctions, etc., they robbed all the money. They robbed the refineries, everything. Now it's supposed to be under someone else's control, no? And it's even there's a possibility, very, very large possibility, that this is going to end in private hands, not under Venezuelan control, not even this fake government, no, but in owners or bond owners from the United States. And for the message for anyone in the world who believes that they deserve a better life and that they should own their own lands and their own lives and their own destiny, you have to organize. No? You have to come together with all those who have needs. No? Sometimes it happens here. The indigenous movement they come together, but only with the indigenous. Sometimes they even have fights between different indigenous communities. No, it's all of those who are victims of these policies, who are victims of imperialism. You are in the front line. You were the first victims of imperialism, of the American imperialism. So you have to, first of all, organize yourself within the indigenous peoples, and then with those African Americans or whomever that believes that the United States can be different, that the system can be changed, that time is not over, that the future exists, that not everything has been created. No? that you can be your children can have a much more better future than you have had in your lifetime. So that's possible, but of course you have to not only be concerned and be updated of what's happening, but you have to move things, organizing, and the only way to move the biggest rocks is if we are all together. That's the only way. We can move mountains if we are all together. And I am sure that I have said this to other people in the United States, non-Indigenous. I can smell a revolution coming in the United States. I can smell it. No, maybe it's not tomorrow or in 2 years, but it's going to happen. And many things are going to help this to happen. I think even this government, this administration is going to help this to happen. But of course, you have to be ready for that. And the only way to be ready is organizing and having networks among all those who want to be really free and really independent. And that, I think it's quite possible. And I will see it in this lifetime, and you will see it as well.
So the last question, because you just brought this up, and I think it's really important. On one hand, Venezuela is on the front lines of this imperialist counterattack by the United States to choke out the economy, to implement sanctions. And its primary target, as Trump has said over and over, is to assert energy dominance.
Yeah.
You have one of the largest oil reserves in the world.
The largest.
Yes. Oil reserve in the world.
Yes.
And and now the United States has launched itself as the #1 oil producer in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Where are they getting that oil? They're getting it from Cheyenne's land in the Navajo Nation.
The fracking.
They are getting it from the Alberta tar sands in Canada.
In Canada, yes.
The Bakken oil region in North Dakota. And to get that oil to market, they have to build pipelines across our lands. So in many ways, we too are on the front lines of this anti-imperialist movement. And I try to tell my communities back home that we can't just think about the domestic context. We have to think about, where's this oil going? Why are they producing so much oil? We're not consuming it all. It's going out to export. And if we see what has happened in Ecuador, Chile, the elections in Bolivia, Argentina, and the months-long protests in Haiti, it dispels the cynicism in the North that the pink tide, and this is a derogatory term, the pink tide here is over, and that we're in this backpedaling away from these social projects. And I want to ask you, what do you think is going to happen in the outcome of the creation of these new energy infrastructure in the United States, and how it relates to the economic sanctions against Venezuela?
It's directly related because we are the cheapest source of oil for the United States. I mean, if you ship here an oil tanker, it's in the States in 48 hours, and it's very cheap because it's by sea. It's cheap. It doesn't require these pipelines and all this infrastructure. So, and we have, as you said, the largest reserve of oil, and all the refineries in the south of the United States are built for our oil, for this special kind of heavy oil that is here in Venezuela. And so that's why John Bolton, at the beginning of the year, when they thought that this was going to be over in a matter of days, and that Maduro was going to be toppled, and he said, yes, we are ready, our companies are ready to go in Venezuela and produce oil. And when he said it, it was like the loot that they were going to get from this intervention, the oil. But it was not possible. So we stop in the United States because we can supply the United States. We have supplied the United States, but they have to pay what they have to pay, and they have to respect our government, and they have to respect the Venezuelan constitution and the Venezuelan law. They cannot take this for free. Before Chavez, it was almost free. The price of the barrel of oil when Chavez came to power was $8, $10. And for the United States, it had some discounts. Now the price is 80, 90, 70, and they want to take it for free. Invading Venezuela and getting control of our oil infrastructure. So we have stopped them here. But this, as you say, is part of the geopolitical plan of, that's why I say that many factors are going to enter to play this role and create the conditions in the United States for a change. Because at some point, your lands, especially in your region, you're not going to have anything. There will be no land because you will not be able to use them, and you're going to be all sick because of the pollution and what they're doing to the water sources and all of this. So at some point, this is not going to be possible, not viable. So and people have to do what they have to do, but it's very important for any group or any people around the world to not to have a short sight, and only concern about what happens not even in their country, but especially in their region. You have to understand the world as it is. This is like a big family, and there's someone that wants to own, that wants to control all the family. So we have to learn to respect all our brothers and sisters, and some of them speak a language and think in a way, and some of them are different and they think in another way, speak another language. We have to learn to live as a family. But what happens in my neighbor's house is important. And if my neighbor wants to destroy my house, it's going to have implications as well. So what we have to do, as I said, we have to create these networks in order for all of us to know what's happening in real time. What are the effects of the Venezuelan invasion in Lakota people? What would happen if the indigenous in those regions in the United States don't stop this pipeline from being built? How does that affect our oil production in Venezuela? Can the United States substitute one oil with the other oil? That's all questions that are from the same chapter of the same book. So we have to be in touch all the time and in real time, and sharing information and trying to understand what they are trying to do, because sometimes you don't see the play coming until it happens. So that's why we have to do it. We have to see all, especially those who suffer, those who are under the imperialism boot. We have to learn that we are all the same. That maybe you and the people in Malaysia or the people in Chile, we all have the same goals and the same needs and the same aspirations. So we have to work together.
Yeah, and it is like a big family.
It is. Yes.
And we all come from big families. And we know what it's like to have that brother, that auntie, that uncle who is that way. But it's something that doesn't have to end at the end of a rifle barrel.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to work for, is peace.